Okay, well, I am Marcia Cummings, and I pretend that I'm a mental health therapist most days and a clinical director, but I'm really Batman. I know that was a really bad joke, but I figure you all have been sitting through this all day, and you might just needed a little humor. But no, I'm Marcia Cummings. I've been a therapist forever. It feels like forever. Um, oh, wait a minute. I think I just hit the wrong thing. Let me make sure I'm sharing with y'all the right. I am. Okay. And let me just speed through. This has 75 um slides. I promise you, I am not going to go through each and every slide. I may even talk ahead. In this presentation, you'll see I have two different, one land acknowledgement and one land welcoming. The land acknowledgement is because I often do this for the Department of Health in Massachusetts. And since I am not from there, I always want to acknowledge, though, the land in which I am providing this on. And you can take a moment to read that. And then, of course, the land welcoming. And this is the beautiful tribe in which I'm from, the Skyway Kanoi tribe, who, of course, resided mostly in Southern Maryland and different parts throughout Maryland, DC, and Virginia, mostly DC and Maryland. But of course, many have made this home from different tribal nations throughout not just the nation, but throughout the world, and various indigenous folks. So we want to acknowledge their presence in this land as well as their influence on all things in the region. All right, so I wish I could tell you I'm going to stick to this objective. We're going to hit it, but in what order depends on where my brain takes things today. So why is this training important? It's very easy to just think, oh, especially if you're in the mental health field, it's just, oh, well, the work is all the same. It doesn't matter who you're working with, but it does matter because you are taking into consideration culture and all the various things that make us who we are, community, culture, various ways of lives. But we're trained one way to work with folks, but many of us probably, once you are out, boots to the ground, doing the work, realize that the real training happened in your office, in the community you're serving, in the work that you're doing. So that's why this is important. It's especially important to understand the various tribal nations that you could potentially come across and the historical trauma, but as well as how the community does impact that individual. So this is all about me. I hate reading it because it's always weird to read about yourself. And that's probably just my own personal hang up, but it is weird. But this is the cleanup version of who I am. And with more hair there. I cut it recently. I always think this was interesting when I found it because a lot of times when we think Native American, we have the long-haired Italian because that's what Western movies showed us. And so that image always comes up. So when I tell folks I'm Afro-Indigenous, I'm often questioned, oh, well, how Native are you? And I wonder if we ever have thought outside of Native Americans, the only other species asked about their blood quantum or percentage are dogs and horses. And maybe it could be some other animals, but those are the ones I'm aware of. We have to acknowledge that Native Americans, no matter what blood quantum may be, can show up in looking in various ways because of various regions they come from. So it's more than just what the pictures that we see on TV. So now we're going to do the numbers. So as you can see, very small percentage of the population, right? But and I need to update that. There are now 574 federally recognized Native American tribes throughout the United States and Alaska, and various languages that are spoken. Many languages, of course, are lost to time because of colonization. And 78% of natives are in urban regions. They are not on reservations. So I know TV would like us to think that, but that is not the case. So what else do the numbers give us? So this is the boring part of things, by the way. Hold up, there we go. Oh, I thought I skipped something. There we go. Even though small population make up one of the largest populations living in poverty, most reservations are in very rural areas. So when we're thinking that, oh, you're on a reservation, you're getting per capita, you're making all this money, there are tribes that do it. Unfortunately, most tribal nations, even if they do have a casino, they're the only ones active in the casinos because they're the only ones that have access to it because it's in such rural areas. And then the unfortunate part of the many of the tribes that do get per capita, and that's monthly stipends from various entities, because they're not taught what to do with the money or how to utilize the money. Many of them still end up living in poverty because they spend the money up quickly. They haven't been given, budgeting advice or using it to go to school. And so just keep that in mind. So these are various tribes in Massachusetts. So you can see the herring pond is, which is one of the unrecognized tribes. And so when you see unrecognized, that means they are not recognized by the state or the federal government. Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe actually today is being recognized by the state of Massachusetts. But without any kind of recognition, you are not eligible for any kind of services. And you then have to start the process of first trying to prove it to the state and then trying to prove it to the federal government. And that can take decades. So many tribes just won't do it. And here are the numbers for Massachusetts. And the numbers can vary. It depends on if they're recognized, if the numbers are counted in that particular state, because here in Maryland, it is not often a checkpoint on census for doctor's office and things. I'm starting to see it, but not so often. Maryland does not have any federally recognized tribes. It only has 2 state recognized tribes, even though they do have a commission on Indian Affairs, and they recognize another 2 tribes. Unfortunately, there are no federally recognized tribes. So there are even less resources available for state recognized tribes. And as you can see the numbers here and how they can vary. So I'm a visual person, so here's a visual. And I need to find an updated picture, but this is the most updated one I can find. So and this is just, obviously technology and I are not friends. So this is kind of what it takes for tribal recognition, fun times. It took my tribe almost 30 years. Don't quote me on that. 30 years for state recognition. And unfortunately, because of internal strife, we've got to work on, once we get that together, we can then work on federal recognition. All right, here we go. Blood quantum. So many tribes do go on blood quantum. So basically, the percentage of native blood you have. So it has to be tested. I was just reading a short story, and the woman had 2 children, one whose father was white, one whose father was native. And because the son whose father was white, they would not be allowed to enroll in the tribe, while their younger brother would be able to. So this is kind of the things that blood quantum can do. It can divide families. So here, I work in Baltimore. I didn't even tell you any of that. I work for Native American Lifeline. So we are an outreach and referral resource, and we provide support to the Nashville region. For us, we have two offices, one here, one in Boston, and we assist in case management, getting resources within the community, especially since we do serve state recognized tribes who don't have access to most federal funds except through us. On the flip side, we are able to provide mental health services, including myself and two other therapists. And then we'll be hiring two more, one for here and one for the Boston office. But many natives that ended up in urban areas have been here for quite a while. There was the Indian Removal Act where the federal government encouraged natives to move off reservations to urban areas where they could have access to jobs and things like that. What research found is that disconnect from community then increase symptoms of poverty as well as disconnection from community, family, which then increase mental health needs and health disparities. All right. So now we get into the nitty gritty of more numbers, because numbers are always fun. So the suicide rate is very high amongst Native Americans. Between 10 and 24, there's an increase, then there's a drop, and then there's a second increase around, I want to say 60 years old. I don't know if I put that in here. Oh, 74. Oh, no, 44, sorry. And then even though you have that high number, even though it's a small population, just think with that small population, the number looks higher. And it's higher. So the issue we have with the numbers is a lot of times what is considered suicide in a tribal nation can impact it, reporting it to agencies. There's a big distrust of the federal government. We can only guess why. A lot of times tribes are keeping their own numbers. And then in certain states, again, like in Maryland, Native Americans are often not counted in the numbers. They are counted under other, or I think, was it CNN that had something else for anyone that wasn't Black or white or Hispanic? And so I literally just said all this. All right, the hard stuff, the historical trauma. Would you believe these are the same young men? I think this is a year later. They were removed from their homes and sent to boarding schools where they would kill the Indian and save the man. If they could be assimilated into European American society, then they could have better lives. Well, that was the belief. And so hair were cut, they were denied access to their families often, many not having returned ever to their families. They died. They're still discovering mass graves of these children. They lost their language, they lost their culture, they lost their communities, they lost themselves. The cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over the lifespan and across generations emanating from massive group trauma experiences, historical trauma. The loss of language and culture that has left so many Aboriginal people bereft of their unique place in the world. It is these disorientations and their psychosocial correlates that the term historical trauma was intended to capture. And I told you, I'm always for visuals. All right. So, of course, we just look at how everything got started, the discovery of America, and then just the movement. More Europeans came looking for riches, looking for land, and viewed or decided to call the natives their savages to justify their behavior, to remove them from the land. And here we are. So now you start removing them from their lands. You're putting them on uninhabitable lands. You're putting them on lands that they've never been on. If they're nomadic, and now they're forced to do it. So they're just move. So even though we hear of the one trail of tears, there are several trails of tears. So this is just one visual that we have. So as they continue to remove folks, disconnect them from culture, then of course we come into the boarding schools where we're going to educate them. What often they were doing is teaching them how to do labor jobs, and they were being loaned out to local families. And I say that very loosely. They were being enslaved almost to local families where they can learn skills. We understand, of course, that it was just free labor. So as you're moving these folks, these kids, the kids are disconnected. You create a generation completely lost to their community. And then, of course, you have the Dawes Act, in which they then decided what a native was. So very quickly on paper, the paper genocide, they could decide if you were native enough. So if you look native, you passed, but if you were a little too dark, you couldn't. They also encourage tribes that if you did marry or procreate with anyone of African descent, then that erased you being native. And so you will find in some of the bylaws of tribes that, you could not marry or have children with anyone of African descent, or you could be removed from the tribe. I have a cousin who's Pamunkey and whose family experienced that. They created a school for the recently freed and freedmen Africans, and that was their sin, and their tribe, they were removed from their tribal census as being native. And even though their names are throughout the tribal documentation, they've been able to prove they are still being denied access to the tribe. And yep, so here we are, the Reorganization Act, continue to take tribal land. So breaking all the trust and treaty commitments of the federal government. And then the Indian Adoption Act, which was then removing children from their homes and putting them with white families. Many of them have never recognized or realized that they were even native for many, many years, if ever. And if you can see the number, 85% entered foster care or were adopted out. And so with that, I don't know if any of you all heard of ICWA, or the Indian Child Welfare Act, that was being disputed in the Supreme Court up till last year, I believe, where a family who had received a child in foster care, native child, they wanted to adopt her, but her family wanted her, and so she was placed with an aunt. They fought, saying that they should have the right. She had been in their home for over a year at that point. Surprisingly, the Supreme Court did side with the family, and the native family, and they were able to keep the child. But the fear of that act being coming to an end was that it happens so often. Native children are removed from their homes and put into white homes, and often not even in the same state. Then with the moving forward, and I guess some of the positive things, Native Americans in 1978 had the right to practice their religious beliefs. So just think, from all the way back to the forced removal, so 1830s and before, and now in 1978, you're allowed to practice. How many tribal nations lost so many of their cultural beliefs or practices in that time? We'll never know. Oops. There we go. And with all of that, that part is important because it's a unique story. We understand the impact of so many who have come to this country, but I think it's important to understand the original people of this country and their story and how it shows up. And this summary of American Indian and Alaska Native history does not do justice to the richness of their past, but it can give you a sense of the centuries-long evolution of their cultures and how the lives of Native Americans have been disrupted by contact with other peoples. Ever since the Europeans' arrival and colonization of North America, the history of American Indians and Alaska Natives has been tied intimately to the influence of European settlers and to the U.S. government policies. The lives of American Indians and Alaska Natives today are to some extent the result of their mistreatment at the hands of Europeans, including Russian settlers. What I think is always interesting when we think of this is that kind of like enslavement oftentimes is the beginning of Black people's existence. The same with Natives. The existence doesn't happen until Columbus mishap into the islands in the Americas. So of course, the unmet needs, psychological damage that has occurred to so many impacted by colonization, which has resulted in very severe mental illness. You hear about high alcohol dependency rates compared to almost all populations in the United States. And a lot of times the mental health needs are unmet because access to resources. Again, if you're in a rural area, the nearest IHS Indian Health Center services center may not be in your state, it could be in another state. So now you're looking at 2-3 hour drives, or like my own organization, they're limited access to things, or they were able to help with. The other thing you run into is differences in cultures and recognizing that natives aren't a monolith. A lot of times we do go in and feel like, oh, you work with one, you work with them all, but not understanding the rich cultures that each tribal nation has, understanding the forced relocation, cultural assimilation, but also cultural gaps that occur. Coming from a first contact tribe, there are a lot of cultural gaps that occur. And so sometimes people feel less native because they lack that connection. And this is a big one, getting providers who are culturally, I don't want to say sensitive, but culturally aware. And then just even finding psychiatrists and psychologists in the region. So, and finding native therapists and psychologists. And many lack training or understanding of indigenous populations. These are some quotes my supervisor and I gotten when they did, and I did a needs assessment. And I thought this was very poignant, especially the one, where was it? The last one, am I a real native? I mean, I don't look like one. I have curly hair, it's not long and flowing. I want to look like a real one. And I have curly hair. Now I can straighten it, I opt not to, but I can understand that, like, what makes me Black, what makes me native enough, what makes me Black enough. And so working on that identity. So understanding that identity is mental health as well, especially with urban natives. So you don't have to do this, but just something just to think about. I do like to ask folks to just think of, when you think of Western medicine, what comes up for you, right? And oftentimes the answers are, and if you want to put it in a chat, you're welcome to. And I think, yep, I can see the chat. You want to just throw some things. So when you think of Western medicine, what do you think of? There are no wrong answers. Medication, yeah. Doctors, white doctors. Yeah. Sterile white walls, cold, um, very individualized, not taken in the community. So these are things we have to look at. So if I am going into an environment, I want to feel what? So when you think of traditional healing, not non-listening, yeah. Traditional healing, what do you think of? And I'm gonna give y'all a big hint because I have it here right under my desk. So when I see clients and they are going through witchcraft, potentially, yeah, I have a big old bag of sage. Yes, this is all sage, y'all. I have my plant medicine, I have my tobacco. And so if my clients are going through something heavy, they may say, I need you to burn some sage. I need to be smudged. And it's very easy to dismiss that, but there is power in plant medicine. It's been proven. There's research now to support it. I have tobacco and sweetgrass and some cedar here. Like at the end of every week, I wish I could say do it every time. I try to open my window and smudge and burn sage to remove any negative energy. But when I'm doing that, I'm thinking of what energy I want to hear. Yes, connection to nature, spirituality. Yep. And so those things are important. So even with various risk factors, and I'm sure there are plenty of other cultures that can relate to this, there are so many protective factors that exist. And that's what makes this powerful. So caring family relationships, access to health care when it is available, support of tribal leaders, positive school experiences, being seen, recognition, being able to share about their culture, coexisting um, spirituality. Because some people, you can be Christian and still practice traditional healing, or you can be Buddhist and still understand and respect Christianity. So it's understanding the dualities can exist and can be a powerful in healing tool. So now here's the better stuff. I've bored y'all enough with all the great stuff. So break and miss, fancy talk programs and providers. So now you've gotten all this stuff. What needs to be done? How do we show up better? So with all these things, this is what we have, right? Historical trauma, all the stuff I read to y'all, health promoting behavioral practices. So if I'm thinking I'm not good enough, I've had all this harm, I'm carrying the weight of my ancestors and the trauma that they've endured. Here are the outcomes. And this is supported by research that happened in Minnesota, hence how urban Indian programs existed. Not now, there's not a lot of research, but there is more research happening. So that's beautiful. And it's being led by natives. Often more non-natives are doing it, but sometimes they miss some cues on understanding certain things. All right, so this is just worldview. Mental illness. One of the things I try to stay away from is a diagnosis being anyone's identity. Because in certain tribal nations, if you tell someone that they are depressed, that's their identity versus it's something they're experiencing. Understanding and being open to traditional healing and other healing modalities is important. It's very easy to want to be dismissive of it, but if that person sees it as a part of their healing practices and healing journey, learn about it, understand it. Of course, economic barriers, understanding all these things. A lot of times folks feel like, well, that's not meant for me. Even when I told my dad I was going to be a therapist, and my dad's Black, and he was like, you're not going to have any Black clients. And he meant it from his heart. And so anytime I got one, I'd call him like, I got another one. I got another one. And he was quick to say, that's your mama's side of the family. I don't know why you're being a therapist. Go get into computers or something. So I'm happy to tell you that I was able to prove him wrong. But and also there's a dismissal of being Afro-Indigenous. It's a double-edged sword. Some say I should just identify as Native and that's it. And others don't like that I am mixed Black. And so there's your double-edged sword when you especially think of East Coast natives who are first contact natives. So that is something else you have to consider in working with urban Indians, the duality of of some of our existence, or trying to be less than or more of anything. All right. So just of course, here's the myth stuff. All natives don't look alike. Big shock there, right? Consider mixed indigenous and unique experiences, state and fairly recognized tribes and even their experiences. My experience within my own tribe. Understanding Columbus did not discover America. Understanding with any culture that is impacted by colonization, there was an existence of them prior to colonization. So honoring that and recognizing that. Also paying attention to the names. My supervisor talks about her aunt whose name is Bruce, and she's given permission to use her name is Bruise on Head. And of course, when she goes to the doctor, they're kind of like, is that seriously your name? Or they question instead of like, well, why would I put that if that's not my name? So being aware of the uniqueness of names and use it even as a conversation piece. And of course, alcohol. Even though we hear a high percentage of natives using alcohol, also consider that they are also the most likely to seek assistance. Here's all the fancy talk. Like I said, getting traditional healers, aligning yourself with traditional healers when possible, understanding the work that they're doing with any native is doing with a traditional healer. Understanding some screens don't, they miss culturally, of course, we know that. And oh, wait, sorry, I'm rushing through. I'm trying to spare y'all. It's the end of the day. So just being aware of that in a way certain things are answered, again, understanding communication styles and the cultural relevance of mental health services to a tribal nation. You know, we have been taught very individualized, but many, if not most, tribal nations are very community oriented. So how does this impact the community? And then also looking at the connections to community. Many are disconnected to community who are trying to reconnect. All right, so here's all the fun stuff for providers. Understanding the unique issues of that particular tribe and the impact of colonization. Understand cultural appropriation and what's okay and not okay. Respecting if someone tells you, you know, I prefer if you didn't do that. Understanding understanding it is a space to get creative in your approach if you kind of just honed in on one style of therapy. And just some good information to have here. Here's the good stuff. So elders are traditionally respected for their knowledge. I get the elder in my tribe, Rico Newman, often with lots of questions, lots of texts, and he's probably regretting the last 20 years of knowing me because of that, but he always gives me patience and responding. Understanding matriarchal societies, despite colonization pushing for patriarchal societies. Warriors have always been appreciated. So if you've ever gone to a powwow, you'll notice there's always, after the grand entry, there's always, not always, but usually a circle for veterans because there's a respect for anyone who has served. And then recognizing everything has its purpose. So you'll hear, actually I'll be doing it this evening. I help support the Two Spirit, which is our non-binary community. Or actually anyone in the LGBTQ community can be Two Spirit. You don't have to be non-binary. It's recognizing that you embrace the various genders around you. All right. And all right, here we go. Here's the good stuff. So what do you do? All right, you got this information. That's great. You sped through it, Marcia. But creating a system that is supportive because there are more natives than we like to recognize. I've gone to meetings where people are like, oh, I've never come across a native. You probably have, but because they didn't look a certain way, you didn't think so. Or because they may not checked it off because there was no place to, that is assumed they don't exist, but they do. So understanding to ask, if they do identify as being a Native American or Alaska Native, what tribal nation? Because that's who they are. Understanding one size does fit all, recognizing that constant and continuous training is important. Understanding each tribal nation has its own unique cultural approach. So asking questions, Google, but definitely ask questions. When being aware of certain things that may not be written down, but also just certain practices. I had a woman many, many moons ago, and she had been diagnosed schizophrenic. And after talking to her, I realized a couple of things. Well, she had, with her previous therapist and psychiatrist, she had discussed talking to her deceased grandmother. Now, with further conversation, what she was discussing is talking to an ancestor at her altar. She was from the Caribbean and just describing some of her practices. But because they didn't take the time to learn that or hear that, they just heard, wait, she's talking to her dead grandmother, and immediately went to crisis mode. When after 2 sessions, I understood that this was a cultural practice, this was a spiritual practice that she and her family did, and that's all it was. And so making sure we dig deeper before we assume psychosis or anything so severe that she was on some hard medications. Um, Understanding the protective factors. If it's some people are used the traditional dancing of their tribal nations as medicine and healing. The jingle dress is medicine itself. A man dreamt this dress for his sickly daughter who continued to get sicker and sicker. He sewed this dress together for her. I forget how many combs were on it now. And he when he put it on her, she began to dance. She got healthy. So if you see a jingle dress, that is medicine happening. So being aware and understanding the various practice all the way to dancing. Um, One of my favorite things is always to look at, if you're a therapist or any kind of healer or provider, a book I read, it said psychotherapist means soul healer. And so make sure you're paying attention to when you're working with someone as a soul healer, what do you see as the person? Are you looking at them just as their sickness? Or are you seeing them in it from a space of healing? Are you thinking about ways you can work with them to get better or just to function? That is all impactful because the work we're doing isn't just about healing the mind, it's the mind, body, and spirit. It's all the aspects of an individual. So making sure you're showing up in those spaces. Um, Understand spiritual interventions, but also honor what you can and cannot do. There are certain things that I can't do from other tribal nations. I can observe, I can listen, I can hear about them, I can't practice them, and I'm going to honor that. Sometimes we just jump on the bandwagon because it sounds cool, but making sure we understand our limitations, because you go from cultural appreciation to cultural appropriation. Um, and it can be disheartening to hear, and this has happened with previous therapists here that were non-native, because you want access to it, but you have to respect that. Even if you don't agree with it, respecting it shows you respect the individuals it's impacting. Um, Finding the resiliency of the individual, not just the sickness of them, is important. Um, it's very easy to just see the diagnosis, they're depressed, but there are other factors. They showed up to your office, they showed up for each session, they are still taking care of their child despite these challenges. So giving them that, honoring and recognizing colonization. It's very easy to think, oh, that was so long ago, you should get over it. But again, we've got the research across the board that this is it still shows up in our genetics. And if it's showing up in our genetics, it's showing up in our lives, it's showing up in our homes. As a soul healer, it's also honoring that and saying, okay, well, this has happened into your ancestors. How do you think it's showing up now? Or why do you think these are happening to you? So here's one of my favorite ones, because this is always interesting to share with people. So I think in how we communicate certain things. So eye contact, and this isn't just for natives, this is for various cultures where eye contact can be can oh now I'm going messing with stuff. Eye contact can be used to let me try and move that back. can be seen as disrespectful, or they can't make eye contact when they have done something that has been harmful to anyone. So understanding if there's a lack of eye contact, it may not be not being honest or various things. Silence is huge. Everyone's probably, if anyone here is a therapist, you've had those first few sessions as a new therapist when people are silent and you freak out. And over time, you learn to embrace silence. Well, let silence happen. Now, dark humor is huge because you will hear a lot of F my life, or I could just drive my car off a cliff. And of course, the therapist in us, or if you are, or just a clinician, any kind of clinician or provider, is to jump like, oh my God, they're suicidal. Dig a little deeper, because these jokes fly even in the office of Native Americans. So if you, as a therapist, if I jumped at every time, everyone in here would have been hostile at some point because there's a lot of dark humor. But I keep my ear open, like, let me just pay attention just in case. But it is a part. In fact, I just read a book, and here it is. And it is called Never Whistle at Night. And the stories are wild. In it, from the first story on. Again, that's why you got to have a good sense of humor, because, and it's not like a scary book, but it's dark. So understanding the verbiage, even how books are written, can be a little different. Using a lot of hopeful language, it is, and I think again that should be just an ongoing practice. How many people in here use humor? Just in your engagement with those you serve, just in your everyday life. I'm inappropriate at anywhere, anytime with my humor. Like if I'm at a funeral, I'm going to find something to laugh at. My aunt passed away, for instance, and I'm just checking the chat, and me and her daughter-in-law are boohoo crying, and her daughter-in-law Amy says, "Well, what is she? What's it's not going to be the same going to her house." And all of a sudden I said, "You mean Hazel's house that she let Uncle Aaron live in?" And we both paused, and through snot and tears, we both bust out laughing, because literally it was really my aunt's house. She really just let her husband live there. Now, is it appropriate? We're sitting in the front row and everybody's probably trying to figure out why we're laughing. No, but it was a real moment. Yeah, that's right. It was a real moment. It was a real statement. And I think he even heard us and said, "You're probably right." And even now he'll tell us how, if he lets the house get junky, she haunts his dreams, like, "If you don't clean my damn house." So, and he gets up and cleans the house because he knows his wife. But these are things to consider. Avoid labeling. And it goes back to diagnosing. It's okay to diagnose. We have to. Insurance says we have to, but don't get caught up in that label. Just understand it's just a description of symptoms or experience someone's having. Now, I have spared y'all many stories, because I have a story probably for each slide, but storytelling is huge. And if you're ever at any of our staff meetings, a story is going to come up. But stories allow people to feel connected to you. They allow you to them to see, it allows them to feel like you're seeing them if you're hearing a story. But reverse, as a therapist, it helps when I'm interacting with our relatives and you'll hear me use client and relatives interchangeably, to see that I'm human. Because when I introduce myself, I'm not Marcia the therapist. I'm Marcia Cummings. I'm Piscataway Canoid tribal member. I'm the clinical director if I'm doing in a work environment. But outside that, I'm Marcia Piscataway, mom, wife, and a therapist. My job will always come last, because that doesn't really say who I am. It literally just says what I do. We already heard hearing and seeing spirits, ancestors, spiritually based beings. Before you run to get the psychiatrist, get more information. Ceremonial practices are important, recognizing that. And then for natives who are reconnecting, helping them identify spiritual practices that they can access. And then, of course, Sundance, Sweat Lodge, Seeking Visions. I have never done Sundance. I hope to be invited one day. You shouldn't just go. I have done Sweat Lodge. It will kick your tail. Not just the heat of it, but just the spiritual piece of it, and Seeking Visions. So with all, if you can create a trusting place in that, you're good. If you aren't open to any of these, you will create a space of mistrust. All right, so here's all the roles of the soul healer, the psychotherapist. All the things that will help you be an effective soul healer. Get consultation when possible. Think about how you word things. One of the things I use, especially working with a lot of folks with substance use, I will talk about the spirit of alcohol, for instance. All right, so when you go to church, you go to the altar, you give something to the altar, right? Well, so you go to the bar and you ask for this spirit, right? The spirit of alcohol. And a lot of times we're going, I want to relax, I want to let go, I want to disconnect, I want to be disconnected from this trauma, from this hurt, from my wife's nagging, from my husband's nagging, my partner's nagging, whatever. But to get that feeling, there has to be a sacrifice. So the first drink, you definitely sacrificing some money, but the first drink does what? Then the second drink, then the third and fourth, then you start realizing the people you're sacrificing, because there has to be a sacrifice for what you're asking for. My time with my kids, my family, my work. And so approaching it that way takes off the judgmental piece of it, but also recognizes like there's a reciprocal relationship. Okay, as the spirit of alcohol, I will take your pain away temporarily, but there will be sacrifices given to me. There will be a tithing of some sort. And so approaching that way allows a lot of folks to give it a different view versus like, oh, you shouldn't drink. Because if that worked, then we wouldn't be even having some of these conversations. So just think about how you're approaching this the various diagnoses or experiences someone is going through. All right, and I saw it in the chat, someone mentioned cultural sensitivity and awareness. I wish I could remember what my supervisor says, because she says she hates cultural competency. It was another word she used, but because she felt when we say cultural competence, that you kind of feel like once I've read a couple of books, I know what's happening. Versus awareness is, yes, it wasn't even cultural humility, but definitely that. I have to ask her what the word is, if she even remembers now. But humility is probably the closest thing to it. But that's important because it's recognizing how I show up, my own biases, how I speak. I mean, even as simple as I'm someone that grew up in Prince George's County in DC. I work in Baltimore. The language is different. Even though you think what's the same state, different language, different interactions, different attitude and behavior. So I have to honor. Now I may talk crap about Baltimore folks, and if any of y'all out there are, my apologies. It's all in humor, but I do recognize there is a difference, and I love my Baltimore people. And now hopefully if this is recorded, I now have it on tape that I've said that. With cultural humility, you're able to show that I'm also recognizing limitations in what I have or what I know. So even explaining a headdress to people, my tribe wore a different headdress that kind of shot straight up, but the headdress we're used to seeing is the long flowing one. And you don't just get that just for being native. There is a earning of that. And some only allow men, some only allow women, some allow both. So again, understanding that. Understanding the prejudice of society. Many people will still to this day will say that I didn't know Indians still existed. I thought they were all dead, or well, you don't look Indian, or you don't look native. And so being aware of our own prejudice in that. All right. I am going to spare you all this piece of it, but this is just explaining all of the how programs like the one I work for came into existence. and just a little bit about lifelines. And as you see, I made the cut in the pictures, kind of what we do. So like I told you, outreach and referral, connecting to resources within the community, behavioral health, and dental services. Kind of the things that stand out for us in the work we do is this, of course, share information for health prevention, health promotion, disease prevention, connecting to community. So we try to have various outreach programs where people can get immunizations, school supplies, Christmas gifts, food. Everything's always around food, centered around food. And that's really it. This is just, like I said, this was just filler things, just interesting facts. But one, you should know Native Americans did not become citizens of the United States until 1924. The last state to do so, I think, was Arizona, no, New Mexico. So that was it. So I will spare y'all the rest of these lovely slides. They're just, like I said, just random slides I just thought would be interesting to share. Are there any questions or anything maybe you feel like I missed that I can add or try to explain? If not, I have no problem asking others and following up with you.
Do you have your email somewhere?
Oh, I do. I guess I should have gone to the last slide, huh? But I will put it here in the chat.
Okay. 'Cause, our organization has started to receive some Native American, and I think this would be a nice presentation that the staff could see and
Yeah.
learn something.
Yeah,
Mhm.
definitely. So I just saw, so unfortunately, we are not allowed to use IHS funds for indigenous of other countries. However, the workaround is we do group, like I try to hold a lot of groups where I don't have to report names. I just need to report numbers. So then we do have a lot of indigenous from other countries participate in that. One of the things we are going to be working on in the next couple of years is grants that for other programs that would allow us to do it, as well as we're going to start billing insurances for our relatives that do have insurance, and kind of start putting that money towards being able to provide mental health services to other indigenous of the Americas. So right now
Uh-huh.
they're able to participate in our outreach programming, our events. They can dance at our round dance, the HIV/AIDS awareness round dance we do in March. Um, yes. A big thing we hear is um Cherokee Princess, and so trying to explain Cherokee and Blackfeet was often used to describe being native, and a lot of people may not necessarily be from those tribes. I always tell folks, do the research of the location your family is either from, was placed, um, or set roots there, and then do your homework in identifying native. Also understand there's the paper erasure of natives. So Maryland, DC, and Virginia for the longest time didn't even recognize that it had any natives, and not for the longest time, forever, didn't recognize it had any natives. And in
Mhm.
Virginia for a long time, there was the Pocahontas rule that you only natives there were if you were a descendant of Pocahontas. Um, so any other questions? Well, I'm glad, and it's a lot of information to try to squeeze it in an hour, but definitely want to get the conversation started for bigger conversations.
Yes.
Yeah, and it even helps me as I'm going through it to first I got to update slides, but also other questions pop up for me as I'm going. So you'll kind of see me moving because I may type myself a note like, "Hey, look this up," or um, And then, for instance, in my tribe, we have one, like we have folks who speak a little bit of the language, but one, I say full-time language speaker is Rico Newman, who's now 80 years old. I'm trying to learn, but at 48, trying to pick up a new language, there's a struggle, but trying, definitely trying. Um, and even that, it's a sister language because the documents that have our language is Georgetown University, and Georgetown today will not give us access to those documents.
That's pitiful. Yeah, you take have your elder carry around a recorder,
Yes,
and
every
record what he says or she says.
every time I'm around, I try to record any
Mhm.
not even if it's a bad joke, I record it because
Right.
you just never know
Mhm.
what's going to.
Yeah, because I did our family's genealogy through DNA,
Mm-hmm,
and we always thought we had more Indian,
mm-hmm,
but we had less Indian, and then a certain percentage of it was Philippine, which we did
mm-hmm.
not know. And then on the patriarchal side, it said the males were direct descendants of China. So that's
Right.
where the high cheekbones come from.
Right, right. And how many people are surprised to learn that about themselves? On my dad's
Yes,
side, I was surprised when we found Middle Eastern. I was like, whoa, wait, where did that
yes,
come from? But it was
yes.
still interesting to find. Um, and Patricia, a lot of folks from Central and South America are reconnecting to being into their indigenous culture. And
Mhm,
like any place that's been colonized, have that disconnect because being indigenous was considered less than in many Central and Southern South American countries. And so I think it's beautiful seeing this rebirth of I mean, they're Native Americans too. They're part of the Americas. Um, and so no, I say claim it and do the best you can in reconnecting. If you can figure out where your family comes from, that may be close, but if not, doesn't matter. If that is a part of your heritage, being from, Mexico or any country in Central or South America.
mhm.
So if Rico were on here, he hates DNA tests. Because interesting about DNA tests, they do have a small percentage of native blood, because most tribes will not give them access. So
Mhm.
what is being tested against often is from, surprisingly, South America, small population though, and the Midwest. Yeah, could be, but like I said, just if Rico on here, he would have Uncle Rico was on here, he'd have a whole fit about the DNA thing. And because he says that it's just another way of erasure of
Mhm.
disconnecting folks from their native culture because they may not have that particular tribe. And remember, many were wiped out, even up until the 70s.
Mhm.
So just take that into consideration. And then, of course, the paper erasure. Many were put under the term colored or mulatto.
Right.
So those are things that, because even so, when we did our DNA test, ours did show up native. I was actually surprised. I was expecting it not to. So I was like, what? So I was on the flip side. And even a friend of mine was like, maybe your family's from the Midwest. I was like, damn, so I'm in the wrong tribe now. So, so like I said, you just you don't know. Um, but a lot of natives will not hand over their DNA for that reason. So
Mhm.
you could come from a tribe that they do not have access to the DNA.
Mhm.
I'm glad I said that because I could hear Uncle Rico fussing at me for not bringing that part up. And I don't want that smoke from an elder. All right. Well, I know it's 4:15. This is my stop time, but if there aren't any more questions, a good book to read. I gotta look it up now. It is Soul Healer if you are a therapist, and if you just want a good scary read. This is definitely not scary, but dark read. It's one of those where you're like, oh, ooh, ooh. And if you do audibles, because I've been doing both, because I'm on the road for a long time.
What's the title?
Never whistle at night. If
Okay.
the saying goes, if you whistle at night, you wake up the bad spirits.
Hmm.
And we don't want that. And please, email, and we are on social media. Let me give you the names. We have Native American, I cannot spell, Lifelines of Baltimore, and the same for Boston. We are on Instagram and Facebook. And you're always welcome to come out. We're having a community feast the Saturday after so-called Thanksgiving. I'm out here in Baltimore. You're welcome to attend. It's a potluck. There's always food, games. And then, like I said, we do a round dance. We do a back to school event. We do various events. And now with us having hired more therapists, I'm hoping to host more mental wellness programming. So things to come. So stay tuned.
Well, thank you for that great presentation. And I'll just remind everybody, we do have one more session today. I know you're probably tired, as I am, but we have a mental health session that's, I think, going to give us some tips on just mental health awareness and maybe how to handle someone in a mental health crisis and those type of things. So if you can stay on, log over to the next session. It's 4:30, but you've got about 12-minute break. So 4:30 to 6 tonight. So thank you for that great session, and hopefully, stay in touch. All right. Bye, everyone.